Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Tonight we bring you breaking news from Central Africa, where the United States has imposed sanctions on a high-ranking Rwandan official. The U.S. Treasury Department announced sanctions against Rwanda's foreign minister, citing his alleged connection to the escalating violence in the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. The U.S. alleges that the Rwandan government, through its foreign minister, provided material support to the M23 rebel group, a notorious armed group accused of human rights abuses and destabilizing the region. The sanctions freeze any assets the foreign minister may have within U.S. jurisdiction, and prohibit American citizens from engaging in any transactions with him. The Biden administration states that these measures are a direct response to Rwanda's continued support for the M23 rebels, and their campaign of violence in eastern Congo. The conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo is a complex and long-standing crisis with roots dating back decades. Rwanda has faced accusations of backing various armed groups in eastern Congo, often justifying its actions as necessary to counter anti-Rwandan forces operating within the DRC. These accusations have strained relations between the two countries and hindered efforts to achieve lasting peace in the region. Some argue for a tougher stance, including sanctions, while others advocate for dialogue and diplomacy to resolve the underlying issues fueling the violence. The U.S. sanctions against Rwanda's foreign minister have sent shockwaves through the region and beyond. Neighboring countries in the Great Lakes region, already grappling with the spillover effects of the DRC conflict, are particularly concerned about the potential for further destabilization. The African Union and the United Nations have both called for restraint and urged all parties to engage in peaceful dialogue. The U.S. government maintains that these sanctions are not intended to punish the Rwandan people, but rather to hold accountable those responsible for fueling the conflict in the DRC. The coming days and weeks will be critical in determining whether these sanctions will serve as a catalyst for peace or further escalate tensions in this volatile region. To truly grasp the gravity of the current situation, we must delve into the tumultuous history of the Democratic Republic of Congo. This vast, resource-rich nation has been plagued by conflict almost since its inception, a tragic narrative shaped by both internal strife and external interference. The roots of the conflict can be traced back to the Belgian colonial era, a period marked by brutal exploitation and the systematic dismantling of Congolese society. The absence of a strong central government created a power vacuum, allowing armed groups to flourish and perpetuating a cycle of violence that continues to this day. The 1994 Rwandan genocide, a horrifying chapter in human history, sent shockwaves throughout the region, further destabilizing the already fragile Democratic Republic of Congo. As hundreds of thousands of Rwandans, both perpetrators and victims of the genocide, fled across the border into eastern Congo, the conflict took on a new and even more complex dimension. Among the refugees were members of the Interahamwe, the Hutu extremist militia responsible for carrying out much of the genocide. The presence of these genocidal forces on Congolese soil, coupled with the influx of refugees, ignited new tensions and exacerbated existing ethnic divisions within the DRC. What began as a humanitarian crisis quickly morphed into a complex web of proxy wars and resource conflicts, with various armed groups vying for control of eastern Congo's vast mineral wealth. Rwanda, under the guise of pursuing genocidaires, established a heavy military presence in the region, backing local militias and exploiting the chaos to plunder Congo's resources. The First and Second Congo Wars, which raged from 1996 to 2003, drew in multiple African nations and resulted in the deaths of millions, mostly from disease and starvation. The legacy of these wars continues to haunt the region today, as armed groups, fueled by ethnic tensions and competition for resources, continue to terrorize civilians and undermine efforts to establish peace and stability. At the heart of the current crisis lies the M23, a rebel group with a notorious reputation for violence and a complex history intertwined with the broader DRC conflict. The group, largely composed of ethnic Tutsis, emerged in 2012, claiming to fight for the rights of Congolese Tutsis marginalized and threatened by the Kinshasa government. However, the M23's true motives have been widely disputed, with accusations mounting that the group is a proxy force for Rwanda, carrying out its neighbor's agenda in the mineral-rich region of eastern Congo. Despite a peace agreement signed in 2013, the M23 remained a destabilizing force in eastern Congo, launching sporadic attacks and exploiting the volatile security situation to expand its control over territory and resources. Rwanda has consistently denied any involvement in the M23's resurgence or providing support to the rebel group. The Rwandan government maintains that the conflict in eastern Congo is an internal Congolese matter, and accuses the international community of unfairly scapegoating Rwanda for the region's instability. However, mounting evidence, including reports from the United Nations group of experts on the DRC, suggests otherwise. These reports detail Rwandan military officials providing training, arms, and logistical support to the M23, underscoring the deep ties between the rebel group and the Rwandan government. The United States, through its recent sanctions, has taken a firm stance against Rwanda, accusing the country of fueling the conflict and undermining efforts to achieve lasting peace in eastern Congo. While the geopolitical complexities of the conflict are significant, it is crucial to remember the human cost of this protracted crisis. The M23's resurgence has brought with it a wave of violence and human rights abuses, terrorizing civilians and exacerbating an already dire humanitarian situation in eastern Congo. The rebel group has been implicated in mass killings, rape, and the forced recruitment of child soldiers, leaving a trail of trauma and devastation in its wake. Thousands have been displaced from their homes, seeking refuge in overcrowded and under-resourced camps, struggling to survive with limited access to food, clean water, and medical care. The ongoing violence not only inflicts immeasurable suffering on innocent civilians, but also hinders humanitarian aid efforts and undermines prospects for peace and stability in the region. The M23's unchecked aggression in eastern Congo poses a significant threat to regional stability, with the potential to draw neighboring countries into a wider conflict. The rebel group's territorial gains and continued attacks have strained relations between the DRC and Rwanda, jeopardizing diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. The proliferation of armed groups, competing for control of resources and territory, fuels a cycle of violence and displacement, perpetuating the humanitarian crisis and hindering development efforts. The international community faces a critical juncture in addressing the M23's resurgence and Rwanda's alleged role in the conflict. Decisive action is needed to halt the violence, hold perpetrators accountable, and address the root causes of the conflict to prevent further suffering and regional instability. The U.S. sanctions against Rwanda's foreign minister have reverberated across the international community, signaling a hardening stance against Rwanda's alleged role in the DRC conflict. The U.S. government, in its official statement, condemned Rwanda's continued support for the M23, emphasizing the urgency of addressing the escalating violence and human rights abuses in eastern Congo. The sanctions are not merely symbolic, they carry real economic and diplomatic consequences for Rwanda, potentially limiting its access to international finance and isolating it on the global stage. The U.S. has called on Rwanda to cease all support for the M23 and use its influence to rein in the rebel group's violence. The international community is now watching closely to see how Rwanda responds to this pressure and whether it will take concrete steps to de-escalate the situation. The U.S. sanctions have sent shockwaves through the Great Lakes region of Africa, where neighboring countries are already grappling with the spillover effects of the DRC conflict. The East African Community, a regional bloc of which both Rwanda and the DRC are members, has been actively involved in mediation efforts, but the recent escalation of violence and the imposition of sanctions pose significant challenges to regional stability. Uganda, which has also faced accusations of supporting armed groups in eastern Congo, finds itself in a precarious position. The U.S. sanctions on Rwanda serve as a stark warning to Uganda and other regional actors that support for armed groups will have consequences. The African Union, while calling for dialogue and restraint, has also expressed concerns over Rwanda's alleged role in the conflict. The U.S. sanctions add a new layer of complexity to the AU's peacebuilding efforts, requiring a delicate balancing act between maintaining pressure on Rwanda and fostering dialogue between the warring parties. While the U.S. sanctions represent a significant escalation of pressure on Rwanda, the international community remains divided on the effectiveness of sanctions as a tool for conflict resolution. Some argue that sanctions can be effective in altering the behavior of target states by imposing economic and diplomatic costs. Others, however, argue that sanctions often have unintended consequences, harming ordinary citizens and entrenching existing power structures. The coming weeks and months will be crucial in determining whether the U.S. sanctions will serve as a catalyst for dialogue or further exacerbate tensions. The international community must work together to support regional mediation efforts, address the underlying drivers of the conflict, and hold all parties accountable for human rights abuses. Ultimately, a sustainable solution to the crisis in eastern Congo will require a multifaceted approach that combines pressure with diplomacy and a commitment to addressing the root causes of violence and instability. As diplomatic efforts continue, we must not lose sight of the dire humanitarian crisis unfolding on the ground in the DRC. The conflict has already displaced millions, leaving countless families struggling to survive in makeshift camps, often lacking access to basic necessities like food, clean water, and medical care. The international community must act swiftly and decisively to address this unfolding humanitarian catastrophe. Humanitarian aid organizations are stretched thin, struggling to meet the overwhelming needs of the displaced population. Beyond immediate relief efforts, there is a pressing need for long-term solutions that address the root causes of displacement and create conditions for safe and voluntary return. Failure to address the humanitarian crisis will have devastating consequences for the Congolese people and could further destabilize the entire region. The conflict in the DRC is not merely a domestic issue, it is deeply intertwined with regional power dynamics and international interests. Rwanda's alleged involvement, driven by security concerns and economic interests in the mineral-rich region, highlights the complex web of alliances and rivalries that shape the conflict landscape. Uganda, too, has been drawn into the fray, its own interests and historical grievances adding fuel to the fire. Furthermore, the conflict has attracted the attention of global powers, with the US, China, and European nations all vying for influence in the resource-rich region. Navigating this complex geopolitical landscape requires a nuanced understanding of the motivations and interests of all actors involved. The international community must work collaboratively to foster dialogue, build trust, and promote a shared commitment to peace and stability in the region. Achieving lasting peace and stability in the DRC requires addressing the root causes of conflict. This includes tackling armed groups, promoting good governance, fostering economic development, and addressing past violence and human rights abuses. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration (DDR) programs are crucial. They provide former combatants a path to civilian life. These programs must be comprehensive, addressing security, economic, and social reintegration. Security sector reform is essential for professional security forces that protect civilians and uphold the rule of law. Tackling impunity for human rights abuses is paramount. Establishing accountability for past atrocities through judicial mechanisms and truth and reconciliation processes is crucial for healing the wounds of the past and preventing future cycles of violence. Promoting justice and reconciliation requires addressing ethnic tensions, land disputes, and resource competition. Sustainable peace also necessitates addressing poverty, inequality, and lack of access to basic services. Investing in education, healthcare, and economic opportunities is essential for creating a more just and equitable society, reducing the appeal of armed groups, and fostering long-term stability. The U.S. sanctions on Rwanda mark a pivotal moment in the struggle for peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They represent a bold gamble, aimed at altering the course of a long-standing conflict. The weight of these sanctions rests heavily on regional actors. Will Rwanda choose dialogue or deepen the conflict? The answer remains uncertain. The Congolese people deserve a future free from violence. The international community must stand with them. Peace in the DRC is a humanitarian imperative. Stay informed about the DRC situation. This conflict affects us all, reminding us of our interconnected world. Educate yourselves on the conflict's root causes and human cost. Engage in meaningful conversations with friends and family. Demand accountability from officials and support humanitarian efforts. Every action counts. Together we can make a difference.